once I filled my costume.
Oh, good morning, everyone. This was a little bit bigger of a turnout than I was expecting, so thank you for showing up on a Saturday morning.
Your fault for doing an interesting panel.
It's my first panel I've ever done, so I'll try and keep you entertained. Word of warning, I am notorious for speed talking, so if I do start going too fast, people here just holler so I can catch myself and slow down. This is Ladies, Lemons and Lawsuits, a brief history of fan fiction. First question, who here reads fan fiction? Who's willing to admit they write fan fiction? And who's here because they got dragged here by other people? About right. Okay, I'll try and keep you entertained for the next hour looking at one of my favorite hobbies. Okay, first off, what is fan fiction? It's commonly described as a piece of fiction utilizing characters and situations from pre-existing works, including, but not limited to, books, television programs, films, and comic strips. It's also a form that allows us to have stories that could not be told in normal media, such as that time Obi-Wan Kenobi and Naruto fell in love at a coffee shop. It also has a reputation for somehow being lesser than canon works, and an inferior form of literature in general. However, this is a fairly modern concept, only about 100 years old. Despite popular belief, before copyright changed the rules, as long as people have been writing stories, people have been adapting and rewriting them for their own use. How many of us pretended to be our favorite characters in Go Adventures as children? That is just as much fan fiction as anything else. This collaboration can be seen through many legends and stories that continue to this day. The tales of King Arthur, for example, are essentially fan fiction. Arthurian legends were oral tales told in France, England, and Wales, resulting in us having multiple different stories from multiple different sources as far back as the 5th century. When BBC's Merlin was released, there were complaints because it didn't seem to hold true to the canon source, despite the fact there is no real canon source. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, from the 15th century, is what most consider to be the definitive source, but as it compiled most of the original folk tales. But at the same time, it couldn't include all of them, and Thomas Malory altered several of them in order to create a cohesive narrative. Merlin performed a similar goal, taking legends and utilizing them as it saw fit. There are so many versions of King Arthur that it's impossible to know the original. One of the oldest known classic fanfics comes from 29 to 19 BC and is and I'm going to butcher these names, and I apologize in advance for anyone who studied Greek literature, the Aeneid written by Virgil. It was an epic poem based off Homer's work The Iliad and the Odyssey, written several hundred years previous. These poems were based on Greek mythology, and much like Thomas Malory's Arthur adaptations, it more or less became the stable source for most of the Greek myths that we know now. The Aeneid focuses on Aeneas, essentially a background character in the Iliad, chronicling his adventures, and is often referenced along with Homer's work, despite having been written by a completely different author several hundred years later. The Aeneid would not exist without the Iliad and the Odyssey. Virgil also gets the fanfiction treatment himself, later appearing as a character in the Bible self-insert story Dante's Inferno, which is essentially a self-insert Bible fic where Dante gets to meet the writer of his favorite epic poem, aka real person fiction. Somehow, while a teenager writing about meeting One Direction is cringe, a 45-year-old novelist meeting a famous literary figure is a classic. Homer's work has even resulted in one of the first fix-it fics. Euripides wrote a play called Helen, in which Helen of Troy was replaced with a double of herself and was not in fact responsible for the war. And it's not just the older classics. Homer's work has been the source for many modern stories as well, such as James Joyce's Ulysses. Thousands of years later, the same stories are still being retold without the accusation of fanfic writing. Another person who by today's standards would be accused of fanfiction is William Shakespeare. Some of his most famous works were heavily influenced by existing works. Romeo and Juliet was a retelling of the Italian poem The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet. And after the play, later editions of this poem were actually adapted to conform with Shakespeare's version. Hamlet was also heavily influenced by the Scandinavian legend of Amleth for Hamlet. There were also tales of a previous play called Hamlet that came out before Shakespeare's Hamlet. We don't know anything about it, and it may have been Shakespeare himself who wrote it, but all we know about it was that it involved a prince and a ghost. It's entirely possible Shakespeare ripped that off too. Despite being derivative work, these are considered classics. So why aren't these examples considered fanfic and are instead celebrated as classic literature? Because the concept of fan fiction did not exist until copyright did. Authors did not always have an exclusive rights to their work. For the era of copyright, due to oral storytelling and the difficulty in publishing, stories in general were considered far more collaborative ideal, and many classics would be considered fanfic by today's standards. Nobody, even the writer, truly owned the text. Probably the most infamous example of this is in 1605 when Miguel de Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, a very popular book for the time, and 10 years later he wrote a sequel. However, before the sequel arrived, another author, possibly multiple, he's never really been identified, called Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda, published second book of the ingenious knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. Now, this was completely unofficial, but people treated it as a sequel because why wouldn't they? Legally, there was nothing Cervantes could do about it, so he got petty. In the sequel to Don Quixote, the title character learns of Avellaneda's book and is outraged at his portrayal. The book then ruthlessly mocks the unofficial sequel, including Don Quixote refusing to go to a jousting tournament because his character did that in the unofficial sequel, and meeting a character from that sequel and getting him to sign an affidavit that they had never actually met. The irony, of course, being, in doing all of this, Cervantes did technically make the unofficial sequel part of the metatext. This all really started to change when printing presses became an option. Before that, it was really hard to publish a book, and most of them had to be done by hand, which, if it wasn't a Bible, couldn't guarantee accuracy. Once printing presses became an option, the concept of copyright became a much more confirmed idea. In 1710, England passed the Statute of Anne, which basically gave 21 years of copyright to any work published prior to its existence, and 14 years to anything published afterwards. Once 14 years had passed, the work would become public domain. Of course, once copyright expired, there were lawsuits with authors trying to extend that copyright, which would more or less become the norm. It was not also as thorough as modern-day copyright. What made something original at this time was that no one had done exactly the same thing before, which meant imitations and unofficial sequels did still pop up. This would continue this way until about the 18th century. Where storytelling had always been the communal aspect, there was a push to see authors as a more respected profession, and not just something anyone could do. There was this ideal of the lone genius author that started to become popular, and copyright law in many countries started to change to match these ideals. In 1886, in Bern, Switzerland, several international countries brought into being what would eventually become part of modern-day copyright. It allows copyright holders rights not just the original idea, but derivative works as well for a certain period of time. Now, there were also copyright in other countries, but this was the first time they had sort of universally agreed on something. This ensured that another Don Quixote situation could never happen again, at least not until the original author had died and time had passed. But while it was always intended for media to return to public domain, this wasn't what happened. As works fell into the hands of author trusts and corporations, they wanted to keep the copyright as long as possible. And to the surprise of no one in this room, a certain mouse-themed corporation has been the key holder in that. They have been fighting, Disney have fought for stronger copyright law pretty much as long as they've had copyright-held ideals in their hands, extending the time after the author's death so they can maintain control. Because of this, since 1923, free domain has more or less been frozen thanks to stricter rules, and corporations are heavily invested in keeping it that way. We are finally getting stories released from that copyright, but with modern-day stories trapped behind author estates and corporations, it's no wonder that fan fiction grew in its wake. This idea that stories belong to a singular person is a very modern idea. Professor Henry Jenkins, Director of Media Studies at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, sort of summed it up quite well. If you go back, the key stories we told ourselves were stories that were important to everyone and belonged to everyone. Fanfiction is a way of the culture repairing the damage done in a system where contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of owned by the folk. And that's all I'm going to talk about copyright. Onto the fanfic. First off, while publishing works was out, it wasn't long before people realized there was a loophole in copyright law. It's about protecting the author's rights to make money. So what if you don't make money? Basically, fanfiction became defined by 4 rules. 1, it was a piece of fiction in a world you did not hold the copyright for. 2, it was written without the copyright holder's consent. 3, it fell under fair use. And 4, you did not make any money from it. The fair use clause in copyright law has been fanfiction's holy shield for decades. It states that copyright materials may be used without permission of the copyright owner, providing the use is fair and reasonable, and does not substantially impair the value of materials, and does not curtail the profits reasonably expected by the owner. Or, in some cases, you can make sure the author doesn't care. For example, after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock, several authors started writing works that did step on his copyright, and he did nothing. Though that may be because he absolutely hated Sherlock by that point. Unfortunately, the estate that held the rights after his passing very much did care, so that became a bit of an issue, but he's public domain now, so yay.
Not entirely.
Not entirely, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
If I recall, they're currently using the idea that Sherlock Holmes was respectful to women to hold the copyright. So that's why every Sherlock Holmes that we've seen in popular media recently has been a raging asshole.
I had heard that was like any story that was written after 1923 or something is still technically copyrighted. I think is where it is.
Basically, the bit where he gets woke is copyrighted.
Yeah.
He's sort of half in how he's Schrodinger's fanfiction. The term fanfiction was first used in 1939, although it wasn't actually used in the manner we use it now. It was considered a term for non-professional works, stories unfit for publication. The sci-fi genre had exploded, and many people were writing their own tales. This term was coined for a lot of early original fiction. Fanzines also became popular during this time. This is some of the first that I could find online. These were not-for-profit fan-made magazines on various topics, but the 1930s predominantly about sci-fi, and often had original stories from authors who would later become famous in the sci-fi genre. Made on mimeographs and held together by industrial staples, professional works they were not, but they were very, very made by people who were very, very passionate about their fandoms. They were also very male-dominated. However, fanzines and fanfiction as we know it really began when a quirky little cult TV show started to air in the 1960s.
Hey.
A lot of fandoms have made their mark, but there are 3 that are truly memorable, and indeed have changed fandom and indeed fanfiction to this day. But the first and most important is Star Trek, aka Genesis. The foundations of all modern fanfic can be found in this fandom. Many, many tropes originate from both the show and the fanfiction it would generate. I could talk for an hour just on Star Trek fandom, and I'm not even in it. This is where Mary Sue began. It inspired many fanzines, and media fanfiction, as it was originally known, was spread through conventions as it was the easiest way to interact and find new copies. Some were sold much like doujinshi in Japan, although only enough to recoup cost of production since they couldn't turn a profit, while others were shared around in mailing groups. And this was quite literally mailing them physically to people. And unlike many future cases, the fanzines were well received by the creators. The first Star Trek fanzine even received a letter from Gene Roddenberry that was spoken earlier. And in his letter, he said, "We have used all the extra copies to make sure that every new writer and anyone who makes decisions on the show policy have read your fanzines." And said these fanzines were not just fan fiction, I should say. There were essays, letters, audience thoughts. At least one fanzine had an in-depth look at Vulcan biology, trying to theorize that their hearts might be in a different place. This was pre-internet, pre-video, and even pre-rerun. People just wanted more content, and fanzines were an easy way to get it. Another change was that while the show was loved by both men and women, the media fanzines produced for shows were predominantly edited and written by women. Unlike other types of fanzines, they also regularly included fanfiction as we know it today and fan art. 83% of Star Trek fanfiction authors were female by 1970 and 90% by 1973. This is actually a very common scenario for fanfiction zines, except for a few exceptions. The Doctor Who fanzines were predominantly male for quite some time. Regardless, they are now infamous as the carriers of fanfiction, loved by both fans and the creators. Some of the fanfiction women wrote in these zines was so good, several of the writers ended up writing official novels for the series. Why so many women are drawn to fanfic has never been conclusively answered as far as I'm aware, but it's generally accepted that, especially at the time, the idea of taking the media and tailoring it to your own desires appealed because so much media just wasn't aimed at women. Star Trek, like many shows, was aimed at men, and while women loved the show, they wanted more. They especially wanted things that no TV would have willingly shown at the time. Given this is a fanfiction panel, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this.
The premise.
The term slashfic was invented by the Star Trek fandom. Don't get me wrong, people were writing it long before this, but now it had a name. A slash in between the names denoted a romantic relationship between the two characters, although ironically it's also used for straight pairings. And Kirk/Spock was the Adam and Steve that started it all. Fanzines devoted to Kirk/Spock, or K/S, started to appear in the 1970s, and they've never really stopped. Other media zines quickly followed suit, and shows like Starsky and Hutch started to see slashfic becoming more and more common. Despite the risk nature of the content, most of the Star Trek fanzines had little trouble. This was mostly due to Star Trek being off the air by the time these fanzines started showing up, and Gene Roddenberry having always been a big fan of fandom. He went on record as saying fanworks of all kinds were the highest compliment and the greatest repayment that fans could ever give us. How supportive was he? He read the slashfic. This is a woman I ideally wish I could have met. Fandom Grandma was in Star Trek /Fic fandom from the 1960s until her death in 2018. This woman literally went from writing from fanzines to writing to Tumblr. My grandmother can't even work a mobile phone. And she had this story to tell about Gene Roddenberry. He read a slash story of mine and got on my case for writing zippers and buttons into the undressing scene. Really kind of chewed me out. Didn't bat an eye at the fairly graphic description of Jim and Spock having sex, but boy was he upset about those buttons. And because Gene Roddenberry believed that zippers and buttons would be rendered obsolete by the time Star Trek would be airing. Unfortunately, not everyone saw fanfiction the way Gene Roddenberry did. While Star Trek created fanfiction and even fandom as it's known today, Star Wars revolutionized media. In 1977, it was a cultural phenomenon, and much like Star Trek, fanzines and fandom very quickly grew around it. The very first Star Wars fanzine was out a month after the movie. Because even these were designed by fans, that's an insane turnaround. Much like Gene Roddenberry, George Lucas also started receiving copies of the fanzines and sent letters to the editors. However, his letter was less complimentary. He stated they were working on their policy regarding fanzines and that a problem with copyright had to be resolved. This was a problem. Up until now, fanzines and fandom had been running a fairly positive relationship. My modern day thinking can't even process sending a fanzine full of fanfiction to a content creator. It's just not something you would do. But back then it was almost standard practice thanks to how well Gene Roddenberry had taken it. And George Lucas started withdrawal of fan interaction with content creators that would take decades to heal. Star Wars was the first piece of media to truly become a franchise. Money was to be made not just in ticket sales, but also in merchandise, including book spin-offs, which meant fanfiction was a threat. Expanded Universe was essentially legal fanfic you got paid for writing, but that meant the free stuff had to go. In 1981, Lucasfilm sent cease and desist letters to several fanzines, stating it will no longer be safe for publishers such as you to feel immune from enforcement action by Lucasfilms. Now, this was, most of the time they weren't too upset about G and PG rated fic. It was primarily the racier stuff that they had a problem with. They banned any pornographic fanworks of their characters, which made many spicier fanfictions vanish underground, only be slipped under a table at a convention table where no one could see. It wouldn't be until the 90s that things really started to shift. When the internet arrived, it was a game changer. Women is still the main source of writing, but it was mostly university-age members interacting online due to universities being some of the few places that had stable internet. Suddenly, you had the ability to upload and share a fanfiction not just with the handful of people who get their hands on the 16 copies of your fanzine, but with literally anyone in the world. You also didn't need to finish, and you weren't beholden to a word count. Fanzines were almost killed off. They still exist, and they continue to exist throughout the 90s and even today, but they're rare. They cannot compete with the internet. Where they were once the only way to read fanfiction, now they're more of a novelty. Email lists were the original replacement, allowing fanfiction to be sent to multiple readers. Yahoo mailing groups also became very popular, allowing for very specific niches of fandom. But as more people started to come online, hosting your own website became a logical choice. If you're under 30, none of this is going to make much sense to you. But God, was it a nostalgia trip for me. Most of the original fan sites were hosted on sites such as Angel Fire and GeoCities. And most importantly, multi-fandom sites weren't really a thing. You had separate sites with separate fandoms if you were in more than one, which at the time was actually pretty rare. This was an easy way to make your fic accessible to everyone without needing an email chain, which meant getting invited on, but did mean writers had to figure out how to build websites. And it was an exhausting process to figure out HTML if it wasn't a nice, easy website builder. The internet was new, so people were learning how to use it as they went. Another way to connect developed, known as web rings, which you can see at the very bottom there. This was where websites with similar tastes or the same pairings or similar genres would be linked through a banner. Normally sites that shared a pair, and it would make it easier for people to find certain stories with similar tastes. People could spend hours and days even just going from site to site on a ring. The 90s also saw the next truly big fandom, X-Files. It was the first big fandom to be born in the internet era, and while it's faded into obscurity more than the other two big names in the Trinity, it did have a heavy influence on fanfiction. If nothing else, X-Files gave us shipping, coined from fans supporting a future Mulder-Scully relationship. Amusingly, fans who did not support a future romantic relationship were known as no-romo fans. They also gave us the term man-pain, which is less appreciative. This show's fans were also some of the first to try and create archives, sites that would try and hold all the fan fiction for a single fandom, such as the Gossamer Project, which you can see there. This unfortunately also made them targets for cease and desist orders from Fox, which several fan sites did receive over the years, to the point of having to consult lawyers to find out where they stood. However, the showrunners themselves saw fanfiction quite positively. When popular X-Files fanfiction writer Layla Harrison sadly passed away from cancer after using her own experiences to write point of view fic for Scully, who'd also had a cancer storyline, X-Files honored her with the character Special Agent Layla Harrison named in tribute. It's also the only show in history I can think of that gave us a homoerotic subtext with the male lead and his male rival / enemy, only for most of fandom to go, thanks, but we prefer the straight pairing. In 1998, however, the idea of a singular fandom site started to die when fanfiction.net came onto the scene. While it was not the first to offer multi-fandom posting, it was the most successful. Fanfiction.net provided easy editing for your fics for posting. It hosted the website so you didn't have to worry about coding or web building. You could hunt down multiple fics and multiple fandoms without having to search in a time before Google. And have favorites lists that would show updates. And was also the first site to really popularize the idea of reviews and comments. Up until this point, most fanfiction was written with no real way of interacting with the author outside of an email address. Getting feedback was rare unless you wrote on forums. Fanfiction.net not only changed that, but helped make it the norm, bringing back another aspect of the cooperative nature of storytelling, and also driving writers absolutely insane with "update now" comments.
Yes.
It also meant people were finding new fandoms easier. Now you could fall in love with a show you'd never even seen, just by reading fanfiction of an author who wrote fic in another fandom and wanting to read more of their work. Many people fell in love with media without ever having watched the original, often because the original couldn't be located. I personally was reading the Sentinel fanfiction 2 years before I found the show. Let me tell you, after 2 years of fandom, that show was a major disappointment.
Yeah.
This is also the time lemons and limes started to become popular as a way of showing a fic would have sexual content. The origins are thought to have come from an anime fandom, specifically a hentai anime called Cream Lemon, and its fanfic mailing list, the Lemon List, though this would fall out of practice by the early 2010s until a short revival on 2018 on Tumblr during their Not Safe for Work purges. Why this became popular is hard to say, but it's thought to have been a way to describe sexual content in the summary without using words that might get flagged, and keep to fanfiction.net's quite strict summary word count. Now, lemons and limes were pretty much the norm, but there was supposedly a full citrus list. But there's some argument about how much it was actually used on websites. I personally was around during this time, and I don't remember seeing anything other than lemon, lime, and I think a single grapefruit, although I couldn't tell you what that meant. The only site I could actually find that used the whole citrus list was Quizilla, which kind of became a fic site by accident, and it's a hilarious story. Quizilla was designed for people to create quizzes to send to friends, but people looked at the site, realized that you could get people to be sent to different questions depending on the answer, and went, choose your own adventure fanfic. And that was what they started doing, using Quizilla to make choose your own adventure fanfic, sometimes sexy. And the Quizilla didn't like that, so tried to ban it. So to get around the censors, all the front pages of Quizilla fics would have a fruit on the front of it to denote how sexual it'd be. Not only did lemons spread out from anime fandom, but multi-fandom sites also started to see common tropes really infect all fandoms at the time, and fanfiction specific genres really solidified. Now this is obviously not a full list, but most of the stuff you can find in just about every fandom is only one bed or stuck on a mountain with a blanket, which literally exists for romantic sexy times. Peggy Sue Time Travel Fix-Its, sort of coined after the movie Peggy Sue Got Married, in which a character travels back in time to her high school days, basically going back to the start of a story, sometimes further back, to basically change how the story went. Everybody dies, everybody lives, nobody dies, which the Hobbit fandom seems to thrive on, along with a couple of other ones. Want of a Nail, where you basically change one aspect of the story to see how it would change things, such as Naruto having a different teacher, or if Zuko was part of the Avatar team from the start. Self-insert, fairly self-explanatory, and crossover is when you were taking mediums that couldn't possibly have met up due to copyright issues and seeing what would go on. Basically Kingdom Hearts before it was cool. And then, of course, you had the alternative universes. Gender changes were mostly to see how stories would change if a character was born a different gender. Omegaverse, Soulmates, and Coffee Shop are basically different varying levels of romantic plot, all the way from Mills and Boone to very explicit. And of course, Harry Potter and his Dark Materials. Just about every fandom has at least one alternate universe that uses these elements. Either a Hogwarts alternate universe or Damon's. Harry Potter was a really big fandom, but I have noticed most of its influence seemed to have been people putting characters into that story rather than it impacting fandom itself. Now, this is obviously, like I said, this is not a definitive list, but all these tropes really thrive on having an original source to exist. You can't really have a time travel fix-it without an original timeline to fix. The internet brought a new era to fanfiction. No more was it being hastily exchanged in the shady corners of a convention. No more was it a little hobby you just shared with a handful of people you could mail. Whether it was genfic or so X-rated, it made hentai anime look positively tame. Fanfiction was coming out of the shadows, and it was out and proud and experimenting. Sadly, after a high comes a low. With fanfiction becoming more and more prevalent, owners of the original content were reacting. Most took a Lucasfilms approach, and none were more feared than Anne Rice. Author of the Vampire Chronicles and extremely possessive of her works, she did not tolerate anyone playing in her sandpit. In 1995, she went on record as being against fanfiction, and in 2000 she doubled down. Fanfiction.net was ordered to remove all Anne Rice fics from its site, and multiple sites that hosted fanfiction, and a few that didn't, received legal threats, cease and desist orders, and threatening emails, making it clear she was willing to take it to court, and she meant it. In some of the emails, they received this note from Anne Rice's lawyer. Know what you're getting into. The threat of personal harassment is very real. Anne Rice does not want you writing fanfiction, and she has the money to make you stop. Do you really want to try this? Big corporations like Lucasfilms had come for fanfiction before, but this was a level that had never really been seen. While no case, as far as I'm aware, really ever made it to court, fear of Anne Rice and others like her resulted in fanfic writers desperately placing a disclaimer at the top of their fics decreeing it fair use. In reality, these were useless. Anne Rice came after fics that used them, and they didn't actually help. But for years, this placebo measure became standard. People posted fic with genuine fear they might receive legal ramifications. It wouldn't be until 2009 that fear of legal battles for fanfiction authors started to fade. Sadly, Anne Rice was just the beginning. People were not happy at fanfiction coming out of the shadows. It had always existed, but much like a spider in your room, it was easy to tolerate when you couldn't see it. Sadly, fanfiction.net, once a beacon for a new way of providing fanfiction, became a gatekeeper. When it first launched, you had to be 18 to join. This was later reduced to 13, and due to multiple complaints, chose to ban NC-17 fics from the site in 2002. However, people quickly noticed there wasn't much supervision on this, and a lot of those fics started getting reposted under the mature level, and with the lemon in the summary. Other sites like Media Miner and AdultFanfiction.net would also pop up around this time to offer a haven. Fics for certain authors would disappear overnight at the author's request, and in 2002, we would also see real person fiction banned, eventually finding a home on the fiction site Wattpad. And while there was some argument for this, later decisions seemed more about gatekeeping what fanfiction was rather than because of complaints. In 2004, script format was banned. And in 2005 saw the loss of Choose Your Own Adventure, Readerfic, Second Person, and Songfic. 2010 saw the loss of forums, which, while they hadn't been used in a very long time, were a huge resource for a lot of fandom history, meta text, and gossip. It was a genuine loss to see them gone. And in 2012, many woke up to find their mature fics had been erased due to being considered incorrectly rated. Whether or not they were was not the issue, so much as not getting any warning to remove them. Approximately 8,000 fics were eradicated, which isn't much given the volume on fanfiction.net, but still a substantial part of fandom history. And that was just fanfiction.net. This list is not even close to all the purges that would happen over the next 20 years, and I do not have time to talk about them all. Granted, some were websites shutting down, but many were targeted at fic that people considered unacceptable. And it wasn't just the West. Many countries over the world would specifically target fanfiction sites. I'm told the 2001 Tripod Massacre was really damaging to Malaysia's fandom society. The problem was that many of these sites hosted fic that was only hosted on that site. Much of it was old and published by people who were either no longer in fandom or had lost their original files. Many of them also shut down with no warning, leaving people struggling to find copies of old fic, desperately looking for people who had saved their own personal copy. However, the attack that would have the most impact on fanfiction happened in 2007. LiveJournal was not originally built for fandom. It's a diary-type site, but it worked well for it, and that's what it became known for. It hosted multiple communities, fanfiction, and was excellent for collaboration. It had a mix of old-school mailing list, mixed with the interactivity of a forum. It was also considered a safe place for fandoms. And one day in May 2007, thousands of users woke up to find the sites they loved gone. The names strike through to show they were deleted. Over 500 sites were gone without any warning. LiveJournal's goal had been to remove any child pornography that may have been on their site, and had chosen to do this by blacklisting tags in the interest lists. There was no real evaluation put into the act. While they insisted they were targeting unsafe content, it wasn't just the dark content that was affected. Support groups for rape and child abuse victims, a book group that had discussing Lolita, roleplay groups, and age-restricted fan fiction communities, as well as normal fan communities that listed yaoi in their interest, were all hit. Many sites insisted their content had not been dangerous, or had been age-restricted. Few, if any, found the ban rescinded. A few months later, another purge known as the Bold Through would happen. Ironically, around the same time Strike Through was eradicating fic, another site was being launched called FanLib, which was a way for people to write scenes that may be used in canon, provided the writer forfeited all rights to the work. Considering there was not a single woman or even writer involved in its creation, it was not well received, and a year later it was bought by Disney and immediately shut down. A lot of things happened after the Strike Through. A new website called Dreamwidth was launched by former LiveJournal members, but it never quite took off the way LiveJournal did, eventually becoming most known for kink meme communities, where members could post ideas for stories in the hopes someone else would write them, until Discord communities more or less took over that role several years later. However, the most significant impact after this event would be a post on LiveJournal, one that would change fanfiction forever. In 2007, in the wake of the Strike Through incident, and after reacting to the launch of FanLib, a user by the name of Astolat suggested something revolutionary. We need a central archive of our own, something like animemusicvideos.org, something that would not hide from Google or any public mention, would clearly state our case for the legality of our hobby up front, while not trying to make a profit of other people's IP, and instead only making it easier for us to celebrate it together. Create a welcoming space for new fans that has a sense of our history and community behind it. They wanted to create a way to get fanfic and fandom out of corporations' hands. Continually tried to profit from fandom while also sabotaging it at every turn. Corporations wanted passive fans, and fans have never been passive. Many agreed, but the general consensus was that this was a pipe dream. The sheer amount of effort that would be involved in creating this stopped many from thinking it was possible. However, others believed it could be done. Fanfiction writers, especially female writers, had figured out how to make fanzines, and then they figured out how to make basic websites with HTML, and then they figured out archiving, all for fanfiction. Why can't they do this? And where this would have remained a discussion for many over the next 2 years, they followed through. They gathered volunteers, put together a plan, and in 2009, a site was launched in beta. Archive of Our Own, a site by fans for fans. The name is inspired by Virginia Woolf, in which Woolf said it in which she said a writer needs space, time, and resources in order to create, in an essay called A Room of One's Own. Archive of Our Own fights for the validity of fanfic on two very simple rules. 1, fanfic is transformative and therefore legal under fair use, and 2, it's non-commercial. It's not a social media platform, like many fanfiction sites have been, but an archive. There is very little it will not allow, considering all content to be of equal value. So long as it's tagged appropriately, it can be published. It's also part of the Organization for Transformative Works, a set of websites dedicated to archiving and preserving fandom and fanfiction history, all of which began in the wake of LiveJournal's Strike Through. This includes websites like FanLore and Open Doors. Archive of Our Own runs completely on volunteers and donations. They also have volunteer legal support willing to step in should a fanfic or the site ever have legal issues. The site domain was in fact registered by a law professor, and the creators have made the site mobile friendly so no app is required, meaning they never have to be held to the rules of an app store. They also have no adverts, so no company can have a say in what is archived. They also stress the no-profit rule. You cannot link a Patreon or similar sites to your profile, and this is a hard line. If you weren't in fanfiction before Archive of Our Own, you cannot begin to understand the difference it made. I started reading during the GeoCities era, and I grew up on fanfiction.net. The idea of not having to put up a disclaimer, not having to deal with ads, and knowing that you could go to bed and wake up the next morning and know every fic you liked was still there was genuinely unbelievable. It did take a while to become popular and was difficult to join at first. In order to keep the website maintainable, you can't just sign up. You need to be invited or enter a waiting list. However, when fanfiction.net started deleting its mature fics in 2012, Archive of Our Own quickly became the go-to website for fanfiction. As of now, there are proving approximately 6,000 new members daily, and the waiting list is currently 40,000 people. Archive of Our Own also created one of the greatest archive search engines in the world due to its tagging system, which is maintained by many volunteer tag wranglers. It's openly coveted by many archive organizations. It does, however, get a lot of pushback by people who feel it should regulate fic. It does allow everything, and this is the first time a fanfiction site hasn't really been owned by a company. They have refused to buckle, and this has caused outrage. Not surprising, considering Think of the Children outcries have always worked until this point. Don't get me wrong, Archive Our Own is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It has flaws, and some people have very justifiable reasons for not liking it. There are some truly terrible things posted on Archive of Our Own, along with some fanfiction that is good as any published novel, considering what some of the men writing women threads are on Reddit better than some published novels. But they have made their source code public. Anyone who can make a site like it to their standards. They just have to put the effort in putting it together. Oddly enough, none of its detractors have. In 2019, its impact on fandom was celebrated. It won a Hugo Award for Best Related Work. Considering fanfiction as we know it started in science fiction, it's pretty apt for a site like this to win an award regarding science fiction and fantasy literature. I also like to think it proves fanfiction is slowly being allowed out as an acceptable entertainment format. Whether people are willing to admit it or not, it has always been around, copyright and capitalism be damned. And shows are also starting to come around to the Gene Roddenberry way of thinking. In fact, we've gotten to the point where shows are not only aware of fan fiction, but openly utilize it. I've mentioned Star Trek and X-Files, the father and son, but the holy spirit of the fan fiction trilogy is Supernatural. Part of the Super Wholock Phantom, but by far the most influential. It's a saying in fan fiction that if a fan fiction idea didn't originate in Star Trek or X-Files, it probably came from Supernatural. And boy, does Supernatural know fan fiction exists. The show, in fact, had a set of books written about the two main characters' ventures by someone who may or may not have been God. I stopped watching long before this point.
He was a soothsayer type character.
He did turn out to be God.
Oh.
Yeah. In universe, meaning the books had a fandom in universe, and the show took every opportunity it could to play with that. There was even a fanfic writing character introduced on the show, Becky Rosen, whose first appearance was writing a Wincest fic on screen. So it's probably not a surprise that Supernatural, for better or for worse, also gave us Omegaverse. And if you don't know what it is, there's a whole lawsuit I don't have time to get into, and you're better off not knowing.
Yeah.
Along with Archive Our Own's arrival, and even before the Hugo, there has been a renaissance for fanfiction. We now have a generation that has grown up with easily accessible fanfiction. Where the average age of a fanfic writer was in university, now it's teenagers. And this is likely because it's so much easier to access than it once was. It is, however, still a primarily female hobby, and there are still many of the older generation writing. It's definitely not teenagers that are funding AO3 during its donation drives. However, it's also a safe haven for people looking for media that speaks to them. I found this quote by TJ Clune. Fanfiction is important because it gives many newbie authors a chance to stretch their wings, usually in a safe space. This is especially true for younger queer writers who are trying to see themselves in a piece of fiction media but can't do so with what's considered canon. Much like the Star Trek writers of the 60s struggle to find themselves in the canon material, many fanfiction readers and writers turn to fanfiction because official media just doesn't relate to them. Even in the modern day, it's a genuine struggle to find media that without the cis-white male being the standard. And fanfiction's validity gives them options, altering the story as generations have before them to fit. However, times are changing. Many new content creators are themselves fanfiction fans, either writers or readers, and support it. Gone are the days where Anne Rice terrifies us into compliance. Neil Gaiman has said that all writing is useful for honing writing skills. I think you get better as a writer by writing, and whether that means you're writing a singularly deep and moving novel about the pain or pleasure of modern existence, or you're writing a Smeagol Golem slash, you're still putting one damn word after another and learning as a writer. However, a note should be said that while creators are in support, the days of Roddenberry sending in a fanzine are long gone. Due to the rules of copyright, authors cannot read fanfiction in fear of getting sued themselves for plagiarism. There was at least one instance where an author had to scrap an entire sequel book after they realized they'd read a fanfiction that had a very similar concept. Copyright law, ironically, also protects fanfiction writers' rights to their work. Fanfiction is a fluid and constantly evolving medium, especially since multi-fandom sites arrived. Tropes and ideas move from fandom to fandom and are influenced by recent media. Once upon a time, writing a self-insert fic was considered cringe or Mary Sue, but in the last few years, self-inserts via reincarnation have become very popular within the anime fandoms, coinciding with the revival of isekai shows and light novels that use reincarnation as a trope. Now, whether Japanese fanfic writers moved to original fiction and took the tropes they liked, or if fiction validated old tropes for a Western audience, I don't know, and I did try to figure that out. But fanfic under the self-insert reincarnated as a character genre has gone from do not read to most bookmarked fic for some fandoms. Most impressively one I know of is in the One Piece fandom, and is one of the most popular fics and is about 2 million words long. Many fanfiction authors are moving from fanfiction into original fiction, sometimes taking the fanfiction with them in a move known as pulling for print. A certain 50 Shades of Grey comes to mind, though that was hardly the first. But it did start asking a question. If the only difference between a fanfiction and a best-selling novel is changing of the names and places, how much can we really consider fanfiction to be a lesser form of literature? And on a slightly related note, while fanzines are dying out, the internet has started to offer options for how to bookbind, or even getting it done professionally, which means people have the ability to bookbind their own fanfiction, which means things like these are becoming a very popular option. And you have no idea how hard it was to resist buying that middle Grimmitchy volume there, just for the fan art alone. But putting in effort to bind your favorite title is something more and more fanfiction readers are doing. So what does the future hold for fanfiction? Most fanfiction fans still consider it perfectly legal, but that's a line still very much in question, if only because no court of law is willing to draw a line on whether or not it isn't. Copyright law more or less forces it to remain in a grey area, though I can only see it becoming more and more accepted as time goes on. Its values and ideals have always existed, and the types of storytelling that it encourages can in fact be seen in modern media. Wattpad has even announced they're working with Viacom to mine stories to bring to screen after 2 fanfics from the site were adapted into original works. How well this turns out, however, is up for debate because profiting from fanfic has historically ended badly for corporations. FanLib was a failure, and in 2013, Amazon launched Kindle Worlds, which allowed writers to publish fanfic for specifically licensed works and make money. It suffered a lot of problems until it eventually shut down in 2018. My personal opinion is that fanfiction isn't something people should be paying for. As much as I would love to have a Ko-fi account hooked to my Archive of Our Own account, it's not the point of fanfic. However, even with Archive of Our Own and yet another company trying to monetize it, fanfiction purges are still happening. Fanfiction.net is focusing more on the original site Fiction Press, and Tumblr is constantly undergoing what's been nicknamed the snappening, where accounts, some of them fanfiction related, are suddenly vanishing if they're considered not safe for work. People and the Organization for Transformative Works are also currently frantically archiving LiveJournal since it's Russian-owned, and maybe disconnecting in the near future because Putin is an ass. And in the last few weeks, the Tolkien estate has put in harsh new rules that condemn all fan-related works. Fanfiction has come a long way, and there is still a fight happening to finally obtain genuine acceptance. But it does remain what it always has been, a way for fans to interact with fandom on their own terms, and tell the stories that canon can't or won't. No matter what, people will always tell their own versions of the stories we love. And in 100 years, maybe Star Trek will reboot again, this time using a fanfic as the source material. Okay, so this was a brief history, and I did not have time to get into everything. Obviously, I skipped the whole 50 Shades of Grey thing, and My Immortal, and the Omegaverse lawsuit, and several of the fanfiction purges, and J.K. Rowling, and a bunch of other angry authors. But hopefully you learned something about this fandom hobby that says all the time. If you want to learn more, I have some links. Jill Bearup's YouTube channel was extremely useful for this panel. And I also have a link to Fanlore, who have tried to archive as much of fandom, not just fan fiction. It's part of the Organisation for Transformative Works, along with Archive of Our Own. And the Talking Fanfic podcast speaks a lot about fanfiction today, and has a great two-part podcast about the history. And finally, Omgrelo offers a patron for how to start bookbinding, if that appeals to you. So, thank you for listening to me for this time. Yeah, anyone have any questions or anything else to add about fanfiction? No? Oh, thank you for, oh, yes?
Yeah, am I correct in saying Anne Rice got better?
Technically.
Well, she does.
None of us trusted her. She did relax herself, but let me put it this way, no one posted an Anne Rice fic on Archive of Our Own until she was dead and in the ground.
Yeah,
And literally it went from dead to 6 pages of Anne Rice stuff archived back from 1995.
Yeah. She was angry.
I think she realised that without fan interaction, no one gave a shit about her books.
Well, also her books just got a bit awful.
I don't know, I never read
She
it, so-
peaked quite early.
Yep.
I do find it kind of hilarious that authors like Anne Rice and the Tolkien estate are or were so wholly against fan fiction, considering their works are basically fan fiction.
Yeah.
It's like the Lord of the Rings is the Ring Cycle fan fiction.
Like I said, people have been adapting works constantly, but for some reason, the big expensive ones are the ones that are, no, mine, you can't take it. My precious.
Sorry, as you touched on
I know.
earlier, the whole idea of copyright means that somebody could take ideas that have been used previously and stick their own personal seal on it and lock it away forever. And I find it very interesting the Tolkien estate is only doing this now. Christopher Tolkien is no longer with us. And, you know, with all the will in the world, no copyright extension is going to get J.R.R. to climb out of his grave and write more laundry lists.
Yeah, I think it probably doesn't help that they've got the new TV series coming out as well, so they're just trying to profit as much as they can.
The TV series that they got everyone's character fucking wrong.
Yes.
But they've got it officially wrong, so that's...
Elrond, politically ambitious? What the fuck?
What?
Yes!
Yeah, it's
That's how they've advertised the character of Elrond. Politically ambitious.
Galadriel of the SAS. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to
Yeah,
that.
girl boss Galadriel. That is literally the line they use.
You haven't gone through Brian Herbert writing Dune, you don't get to be upset.
Fair enough. I
Yeah.
accept this.
I'm still feeling it almost 20 years later.
I think
Anyone
we all
else?
have our own personal bugbear.
Yeah, I think so.
Questions so much, but would you mind uploading the slides onto the Facebook groups so that you can have a look at the links?
Please.
Yeah, I can put it up onto Facebook, no problem. I'm also attempting to film it, so it should be up on YouTube as well.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I'll put that up onto Facebook. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for joining me this morning, and I hope you enjoyed it.